Well, good afternoon, everybody. We had quite a few folks who RSVP'd for this, so while I'm going through housekeeping, we may have some additional folks joining us. I'm Rebecca Samolsky. I'm the Executive Director of Fire Adapted Colorado, and thank you all for joining us on this call this afternoon. We're going to cover some updates on CWPP standards and guidance for Colorado, as well as the preliminary research findings on how stakeholder relationships influence wildfire risk mitigation planning and implementation. This conversation's been a long time coming, so I'm really looking forward to it, and I hope you all are as well. Just a few items of housekeeping before we get rolling. Please stay muted when you are not talking. I've got a few co-hosts here who are able to help me mute you if you get some background noise. Feel free to drop any questions that you have as we are going along into the chat. And when we finish each of the sections, each of the parts of our presentations today, you can use your Zoom reactions to raise your hand, and I'll call on you to come off mute and join the discussion when we get to those discussion parts of the conversation today. And if you have trouble finding the raise hand, oftentimes in my menu, it gets hidden under the little ... more tool, and you have to go to reactions, and then you'll have options to clap and raise your hand and put on your coffee cup if you have to take yourself a quick break. This meeting is being recorded, and you also have the ability to turn on closed captioning if that is helpful for you. It is an automatic transcription, so it's not going to be totally accurate, but the recording, we will edit the captioning for the recording, and that will be posted on the Fire Adapted Colorado YouTube channel and shared out in our April newsletter. And I just wanted to invite everybody, just to get going with chat, to introduce yourself and where you're at in the chat. Find that feature so you can ask questions later, and let everybody know that you're on today. I have to turn off my closed captioning because it's kind of interfering with my view here. So just a little bit of background on Fire Adapted Colorado, or FACO for short. We're a statewide learning and impact network with over 140 individual members representing over 80 organizations around Colorado. The FACO network serves as a connecting force and a collective voice to grow capacity and impact our collective ability to help Coloradans coexist with wildland fires. We also convene the Colorado Wildland Fire Conference every year and a half, and the next conference will be in Fort Collins in just under a year, in the second week of April 2023. We also host ongoing forums and regular member calls, and have learning exchanges. In the past, we've done learning exchanges such as site assessment tools, post-fire recovery, and building your fire adapted community neighborhood ambassador approach. And we share a lot of science resources and learning opportunities that are provided by partners, for which there have been a tremendous amount over the past couple of years of resources coming out in webinars. An example of one of these upcoming webinars is the Colorado Division of Fire Prevention and Controls sharing a 2022 Wildfire Preparedness Press Conference at 11 o'clock this Friday. That's going to be at the Wings Over the Rockies Museum in Inglewood and viewable live on the DFPC YouTube channel. And I'll drop a link for info in the chat in a little bit here. May is also our Colorado Wildfire Awareness and Preparedness Month, and Wildfire Community Preparedness Day is on the first Saturday in May. So Cindy, FACO's Operations and Communications Specialist, is sharing resources for those campaigns. And we host webinars on additional topics of interest as the demand dictates. So last month we had over 140 people on the Wildfire Legislative Updates call, because there have been a lot of state and federal bills related to wildfire this legislative session. And next month, I'm working with the Center for Collaborative Conservation, Southern Rockies Fire Science Network, Colorado Forest Restoration Institute, and JW and Associates to put on an infrastructure law and forest collaboratives overview and program potential webinar. So that'll be the morning of May 25th. So I'll drop the link to that as well in the chat. And if you get the Fire Adapted Colorado newsletter, you'll see information about that. And that context of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act is also one of the reasons that this call about community wildfire protection planning is really important right now. Among the many provisions in the Infrastructure Act, which is also frequently referred to as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, there's a $500 million appropriation to develop a new program in cooperation with the states to award community wildfire defense grants to at-risk communities. So that I am just going to share a few tidbits of what is directly in the legislation about the Community Wildfire Defense Grant Program. I haven't seen anything official yet about how it's going to roll down through the states or directly through federal agencies. But if anybody on this call has further information, I'll give you the opportunity to share later, or let us know that in the chat so we can give you space to share if you likely have more knowledge than me. So with the community wildfire defense grants, they are for two things. They're legislated to be for two things: to develop or revise a community wildfire protection plan, and that's for up to $250,000 per award, and generally requiring at least a 10% match. Or B, to carry out projects described in a community wildfire protection plan that's not more than 10 years old. So implementation of those plans. And those awards are for up to $10 million and generally require at least a 25% match. Now that's the legislatively directed amount. So you may eventually see something come down through the state or through a different agency that doesn't allow, at your scale of local work to be requesting those sizes of grants. There's also priority given to very high wildfire hazard potential areas, low-income communities, and a community that's been impacted by a severe disaster. If you have questions as I'm going through this that you would like FACO to look for answers for, please drop those in the chat and we can be searching for those and try to get those answered if no one on the call can answer those directly. The final really important legislative provision of the Community Wildfire Defense Grants, to give a little bit more context here to getting into CWPPs, it says for eligibility that the Secretary of Agriculture shall not award a grant under the Community Wildfire Defense Grants to an at-risk community located in a county or community that has not adopted an ordinance or regulation that requires the construction of new roofs on buildings to adhere to standards similar to or more stringent than the roof construction standards established by the National Fire Protection Association or an applicable model building code established by the International Code Council. So that is a shall not. I have heard various discussions about from the national office level and the committees who are looking at this about, is there any way around this? I'm just going to tell you right now that the language in the legislation is that they shall not go to any communities that have not adopted an ordinance requiring new roof, wildfire resistant new roof construction standards. So that's my fun context around community wildfire defense grants and looking to fund development, updates, and implementation of community wildfire protection plans that are less than 10 years old. So our first presentation is going to be from Daniel Beveridge. He's the Fire, Fuels, and Watershed Manager for the Colorado State Forest Service. And he's going to share with us today the recently updated CWPP standards and guidance for Colorado. This highly anticipated update for improving community wildfire protection planning and implementation has been in the works for a while. In fact, at our 2020 Colorado Wildland Fire Conference strategy session, we focused on providing some initial input on what makes CWPPs effective. And it's exciting to see all of that input and the research directing changes on how we do CWPPs in Colorado. So I'm excited to see that work incorporated. I'm going to let Daniel work on pulling up his screen share here and turn it over to you, Daniel, to share with us the updated standards for Colorado.
Great, thanks, Becca. Can I get confirmation everybody can still hear me? All right, okay. Y'all may have noticed just moments ago, I know how things can get buried in the chat, but just a short time ago, I added a link to the current CWPP minimum standards. Can I get some confirmation from anybody that that link is viable?
It works.
Okay, great. Not a requirement by any means that folks follow along, but the reference is there. I'm not providing a reference to our older standards. There's just not as much value in that necessarily, but folks might want that in the future. I'd be happy to provide it as needed. So stand by for a moment while I pull up my presentation. Many tabs open. Thank you. Okay, is everyone with me? You can see my screen, in other words?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Again, as Becca said, my name is Daniel Beveridge with the Colorado State Forest Service, Fire Fuels and Watershed Manager. And I'm glad everybody's here. We're excited to see how many folks were signed up for this presentation, and hopefully there'll be folks that were unable to be here in person can watch the recording and gather some valuable information from it. As Becca said, there was a significant amount of effort that was put into this overall. This wasn't an isolated effort by any means. There was recognition for some time that the previous guidance produced by my organization in 2009 was aged. Program review efforts began in earnest in 2018 when I came back to this organization. I was a member of the Colorado Division of Fire Prevention and Control for a time since its inception until 2018. And that is not at all to say that CWPPs had gone by the wayside and weren't being considered and discussed, to provide additional updates and guidance and figure out what wasn't working and what might work better for all residents and partners in the state of Colorado. But there's been a significant amount of research that really built the foundation for a lot of these updated guidance. I'm just listing a small amount here that I have up on the slide. In 2016, a former member of the Colorado State Forest Service, still in the Colorado State University system, Courtney Peterson, did this research on the left, understanding community wildfire protection plans in the state within the Human Dimensions and Natural Resources program within the Warner College of Natural Resources, which is actually where the Colorado State Forest Service is housed. So, that number of years ago, we were, producing research to better inform what really has turned out to be this effort where we are now. At Northern Arizona University, the Ecological Restoration Institute supported some research that was designed specifically and prompted by the state of Arizona and their Forest and Fuels Fire Management Program to learn some more about this, but they did a much broader set of research that addressed more regional issues, and Colorado was included there as well. One of the other really valuable things that really is worth mentioning is the fact that the Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network, the national network, kind of a parent group to Fire Adapted Colorado, not long ago established a CWPP 2.0 working group in which folks from all across the nation actually got together to talk about this very topic. And that provided a lot of really, really valuable information. And it really was the second version, because there was a CWPP working group 1.0 that existed beforehand. So there's been a lot of background work done on this, particularly in other Western states as well. So a tip of the hat obviously has to go off to the state of New Mexico as well. I don't know that anybody is on from there, but they provided a lot of good ground layout from 2015. And just recently in 2021, I believe they updated their CWPP minimum standards for the second time. So there was a lot of value in learning from these other folks. We also knew about some of these funding linkages that would be coming down. Recently, there was state legislation to support the Healthy Forests and Vibrant Communities Act that provides some funding to my organization. The federal infrastructure bill that Becca mentioned earlier, I generally just shorten it to infrastructure, but we knew that that was inbound. And we had, as I mentioned, been working on developing an update to these plans for some time. So there was a bit of a sense of urgency. So although we wanted to ensure that we talked to every single person in the state that was interested in CWPPs, that just wasn't really a viable option. But tip of the hat also goes off to Becca, who, as she mentioned during our 2020 fully immersed in the pandemic Colorado Wildland Fire Conference, we did a virtual session to discuss with folks CWPPs, and that was a really, really valuable source of information for a lot of these updates as well. But this was the main goal, right? To maintain the flexibility that these plans afford while addressing the reality of urgent current conditions, right? I mean, we are seeing a significant increase in the number of fires, their intensity, and their related damage. So this was needed. The similarities between the old standards and the current standards that were just released, so the format is more or less the same. Naturally, they both were tiered to the original foundational federal guidance, the 2003 Healthy Forest Restoration Act, shortened to HFRA. And just so everybody knows, these are the most fundamental basic background requirements from the expectations at the federal level. These need to be collaboratively developed, okay? They also have to address prioritized fuel reduction. And the final thing is addressing structural ignitability. Now, this is some information that folks may not be aware of, but this is really good foundational background, because when all of these things are addressed, these plans really are put on good footing in order to be valuable and effective for communities of any size, really anywhere in the nation. The signatory authority is the same. So the folks that are expected and necessary to approve these plans are the local government official. So that really varies. You know, it could be a mayor, could be the president of the homeowners association, it could be a county commissioner, an emergency manager. The list goes on and on, but it depends upon the scale of the plan itself. The appropriate local fire authority. So again, that's related to the scaling of the program or the plan itself. And then the appropriate state forestry organization official. And within our organization presently, that's the individuals within our organization, the Colorado State Forest Service, that are at the supervisory forestry level. The required elements that were in the prior plan that must be included are essentially the same. So there are certain dissimilarities, but many similarities. And I'm going to move on to those differences here in the next slide. We condensed a lot of the language because some of it was frankly a little bit confusing. This concept of a core group or a core team, the language is variable from one source to the next. But it's important to recognize that that core team is expected to be the approving authorities that I mentioned on the prior slide, not the community as a whole. And that was a piece of some language that it was a little bit confusing in the plan prior, the guidance prior. One of the other differences is the participant documentation. There was documentation that was required beforehand, but the results of that documentation and the names and affiliation of people that are involved is an expectation of this new plan. This is not at all dissimilar to emergency management plans. That's a very common practice, but this was one of the reasons why this was considered to be valuable and important, was to ensure that the collaborative nature of these plans was really executed appropriately. We actually removed the community preparedness to respond to wildfire portion of these, because there is not really an expectation, there never really has been, that these plans support an operational kind of sort of pre-attack plan. Now, that does not say by any means that that cannot be included, but is not actually required as a minimum standard. So it was very common in the past for plans that were according to boundaries of fire agencies. It was very common for them to be very heavy, relying upon, you know, the number of resources and how they would respond in certain scenarios and so on. So That's not a requirement at present, but it can be included if desired and useful. We've added in some should and may include sections to this update, and I'll explain that in a little bit. But initially, I will say that what is must be included is actually a requirement. Should and may are the guideline portions. It's valuable to add in those things, but they're not actually required. And then we've added in some update timeline and some guidance for those purposes as well. This has nothing to do with community wildfire protection plans. I put this in as the central slide, so I'm halfway done. Just a reminder for me, thanks everybody for holding off on questions until we're finished, but hope you enjoyed that photo. On to what the plans must include. You'll see the asterisks here. They basically tier to the concept of the federal guidance. Plans must include a definition of the selected planning area that must be mapped. Okay, so this concept of delineation of the urban interface, this is one of the beautiful things about community wildfire protection plans is the community can decide for itself where their urban interface is. And if there is a need for the community to expand that definition from what has been considered traditional, that is perfectly acceptable for them to do. And the idea being that that can help promote or encourage federal organizations that may own land nearby where this community is to prioritize their treatments on their lands that they own. Identification of adjacent landowners is also a requirement, and there's a lot of value in that, and it really tiers directly to the concept of the collaborative spirit in many ways. Wildfire risk analysis. Now, it's important to recognize that we don't have a formalized template necessarily that explains exactly how this risk analysis needs to be defined or laid out. But we do have some subset requirements that the risk analysis must address. And that is fuel hazards, fire history. The risk of wildfire occurrence was excluded, actually. Okay, so to be clear here, this risk of wildfire in many ways can be very much subjective. So we've chosen to eliminate that. Now, again, things that we've eliminated from the prior standards can still be included in new plans, but they are not actually required. Common structure vulnerability characteristics is being included in this section. So this concept of a community risk analysis, whether it doesn't matter which organization is executing this type of thing, but for those that are less familiar with this, we have resources available to provide some further definition. Community values is arguably the most important portion of these entire plans, right? Going back to the foundational concepts, it's shared community values that really are the baseline for these plans and their productivity. So shared community values really are the foundation of all of it. So once communities can agree upon the values that they share, it logically follows thereafter that they can relate those to the associated wildfire risk that exists, and then establish a tiered and prioritized action plan for reducing. And then formalizing the methods to reduce the structure ignitability that's addressed within the risk analysis. Carrying on what must be included is an implementation plan, okay? This is the portion that's related to the federal standards, the treatment types and methods. There was understandably some confusion about why we need to get so down into the weeds, as it were, about this particular concept, but it's realistically because we are obligated by the federal standards to do just this. And it's important to understand that when we talk about wildfire risk reduction projects, it doesn't just mean fuel treatments. It doesn't mean necessarily exclusively mowing grass, eliminating shrubs, thinning stands of trees. It can go much farther than that. It can be educational efforts, outreach efforts, and establishment of demonstration sites and the like. So it's important for folks to think a lot more broadly than we traditionally have with these plans. Treatment maps are important in order to explain where these fuel treatment priorities are. And going back to one of the things that Becca had mentioned originally in the introduction is there is about to be a significant amount of funding available for this very purpose. So having these prioritized allows for these funds to be allocated to groups that have said, we recognize our community values, we've done a risk assessment, this is why we want this money to treat this, whatever it may be, shrubland, forest land, so on. And then ranking them with relative priority. This can be one of the more challenging portions of the task, but it's important for that to be done, right? Providing that information through a narrative or a table is really beneficial for folks to not only share that information with their communities, but also to request funding when opportunities. Onto the should include and may include portions. So to expand a little bit upon these concepts, right? As the idea of CWPPs had evolved and through a lot of the efforts of these working groups, it was recognized that there were a lot of aspects that communities had learned, before, during, and after wildfires that weren't traditionally addressed in community wildfire protection plans. So these are where we've chosen to address those with our minimum standards. Emergency notification resources vary significantly from one corner of the state to the next. So there's really immense value in, folks that are working on this inevitable planning to be able to share that out with their community. So it's not terribly difficult to find that information, but there's a reason why it's encouraged, right? We want to ensure that when a wildfire happens, people know how to be notified and how to depart. Relating to this evacuation information, which is a really critical aspect as well, but I won't belabor that here and now. Addressing socially vulnerable population considerations is also quite important, particularly depending upon the scale of the plan. If it's a larger scale plan, undoubtedly there's going to be some socially vulnerable populations included, and it's important that we address them. And then offering a commitment for revision. When we have plans approaching 20 years in age, I think everybody would agree that the initial recommendations and assessments done of risk and prioritized planning are quite likely out of date. Plans may include post-fire considerations, considering flood damage, issues with infrastructure, the list goes on and on. But then also integrating the possibility of hazard mitigation plan elements through these FEMA plans. So there are a number of counties, particularly in the eastern portion of the state of Colorado, that don't have community wildfire protection plans in place, but they do, in fact, through their hazard mitigation plans, address a lot of these issues. So there are many opportunities to integrate those two plans. And we have, as an agency, provided some guidance for those that are interested in going down that path. So this has been a really fascinating piece of a lot of this research, and it's kind of the most magical question, some might say, that are involved in this kind of work is what scale is appropriate for CWPPs? Here in the state of Colorado, it really is driven by community need, and we allow all scales, right? So it can be from the smallest homeowners association to multiple counties if desired. There are certain Western states that only have community wildfire protection plans at the county level. That doesn't really suit the needs for the diversity of the state of Colorado. So we allow them to be at a variety of levels, but realistically, that needs to be driven by the community itself. For larger plans that are at the county level or the fire protection district level, those must identify landscape scale fuels treatments for the highest risk communities. In the past, this is another slight modification that has been created with these updated standards. It said all communities. So it's very realistic that within a large scale, broadly diverse county, both demographically, but also geographically, with fuels and risk that exists, there could be communities that have very limited wildfire risk. So we all recognize that all communities experience some risk, but it's important to prioritize that risk with larger scale plans for the highest risk communities. Now I don't want to get too specific into this. It's worthwhile potentially to tease out some questions that may exist through questions towards the end of the presentation. I am approaching the end here soon, but for subset communities. So if you are within a larger scale county and you want for a subset plan to be recognized, these are the things that will need to be done by those smaller communities, is identifying and prioritizing activities that are specific to that smaller subset site, providing a related specific implementation plan, and just developing something that's specific for that very community. Because as I'm sure folks can imagine, in a larger community, county that has numerous communities, it's very difficult to develop a plan that addresses the true intimate nature of the risk that each of those communities experience. But this quote is actually taken from the guidance itself. Adequate detail about project level design, layout, and execution needs to be provided to allow work to begin. And the plan needs to be supported by the folks that it's meant to serve, essentially. So on to the lifetime of these plans and the update expectations. You know, a lot of this guidance was served by the emergency management community, folks that have been doing this kind of thing at a broader scale for quite some time. A lot of it has been guided by certain FEMA directives and so on, and it's just been broadly recognized that if plans are updated every 5 years, they're significantly more useful than they otherwise would be. And I have been hearing significant amounts of concern about how challenging this actually could be. And we worked our best to recognize that this can be an intimidating task, but the update to a community wildfire protection plan doesn't need to be overly laborious. It certainly doesn't necessarily need to involve the amount of effort that went into the origin of a plan, but it's a really valuable opportunity to critically analyze whether or not the plan is serving the needs of the community and meaningfully reducing the wildfire risk that exists there. So we've chosen to decide that if plans are greater than 10 years old, they won't be prioritized for competitive funding opportunities. Now, that does not mean that they will not be recognized whatsoever for not having a community wildfire protection plan. But if there is a tiered or ranked scoring system in which communities that need to rely upon this type of plan have one that is more current, they will in fact score high. So there's a broad variety of funding sources that exist to reduce wildfire risk, but that's the path that was chosen. Updates can be a preface to an old document, an old plan, or they can be a new document entirely with the updates integrated within. And this is what the updates must do, is describe the progress since the plan originated or the most recent update was completed, and list accomplishments. Demographic change is important to recognize, particularly here in Colorado, where we're having so much of that change. We are having a lot of new communities being built, particularly after certain disasters occur. That can drive demographic change as well, but it's important for those concepts to be addressed. Identifying new risks that may have developed since the last time the plan was updated or originally created, and then listing and prioritizing new projects. I'm not going to get nitpicky into the suggested update process, but this is the essence of it: to review the plan that exists, to engage stakeholders that are involved, collaborate together, document the work that has been done, develop new priorities, provide the update, and distribute it to the folks that really will put it into practice. It's a lot of information. I hope that was valuable for everybody. Becca, do you think it's best to field questions that are specific to my presentation at this point?
Yeah, I think that would be great to address a few quick questions now. And then if you're open to it, to take some more at the end if other things come up after the CoNIFER presentation. And one quick request from Maya Mackhammer at Boulder Watershed Collective was to see if you would be willing to share the slides as well. Sure.
Yeah, certainly. With it being recorded, I have no issue with sharing the slides out. Yep.
So there was, I know Ed Gardner asked a question that got a few different answers in the chat, but he was asking if the county creates the project maps or who creates those. So I'd love to know your take on that as well. And then others, you can feel free to raise your hand and I'll call on you.
I'm not sure how to answer because it really depends upon the scale and who the core team is my most accurate response that I think I can provide. Because if it is a county level plan, right, I mean, the individual that would be the authority and the representative of the core team on behalf of that county, you know, again, as I mentioned, it could be a commissioner, a set of commissioners, an emergency manager, which are the most common representatives of that local government. So again, it depends upon the scale, you know, in the sheriff's office to an extent would need to be involved, as well as the local fire authority, depending upon who, you know, the signatory would need to be, whether it's a delegate or the sheriff himself. Am I getting at the answer to the question? You're muted, Becca.
Yeah, and I think there were some additional good ideas of where to go in the chat as well. So I think that is fine. Philip Brinkman with the Grand County Wildfire Council was asking if an HOA could adopt those roofing standards or adopt WUI codes within their architectural standards to qualify for grants when the city or county will not do so. And I'm assuming he's referring specifically to the Community Wildfire Defense grants, because I don't think any of our state grants require that. Do you have anything to weigh in there?
Not being a specialist in local codes and ordinances, I fear that I don't have much to contribute. I anticipate that locally they could make such an adoption, but I'm just not very familiar with that practice.
Yeah, and there are, we definitely through FACO have examples of HOAs that have adopted their own WUI building codes and regulations within their architectural review guidelines. Whether or not that's going to make you eligible all the way at the HOA level to apply for community wildfire defense grants when they roll out, I don't know yet.
Time will tell.
Yeah. Yep. Sorry, it can't hurt. the whole intent of that regulation, of that requirement in the law, is to get people to build better from the start, right? Make our homes more fire resistant. So it can't hurt to do that regardless of whether the money comes down.
Agreed.
This one's more specific to you. Lilia asked if there's a grandfather period for the 10-plus-year-old plans related to funding prioritization. For example, will counties with 10-plus-year-old plans be subject to the new requirements for the furworm funding round this fall? Okay, so good question there. If you already have a plan, are you eligible for state funding?
Yeah, great question, Lilia, and I understand why you ask. You know, that's still being developed presently, and I think it's being built into the tiered system within the furworm program. So I have spoken to Diana Selby about that, because she's really driving the bus when it comes to the furworm program, and I know that she's vetting that information through her group of folks that basically provide, you know, her external scoring panel to land with some of that. So I anticipate there being some generosity afforded with the, you know, recent nature of this delivery.
Good, thank you, that's helpful. Stephen asks if we know who will be able to apply for this money, county or city government, HOAs, nonprofits. That's a request, I believe, regarding community wildfire defense grants. I don't know if you've heard anything more from your seat at the state.
I do not know for sure, Stephen. One thing I do want to provide some expansion on is this idea of the Healthy Forests and Vibrant Communities funding to be utilized for this purpose. So state funding will also be allowed to support development and update of CWPPs, but we're in the very early stages of the process to support that effort. So stand by for more information, but we intend to be broadly inclusive for folks that are interested in or in need of some of that funding for that purpose. It's difficult because we still have so many questions about the CWDG fund. So again, time will tell. Thanks again though, Becca, for trying to get somebody lined up to provide some clarity on that. I think within the next couple months, we'll have a lot of information.
Yeah, I think I'll need to take some of this list of questions, and if there's questions you have that you know that Daniel and I can't answer, drop them in the chat anyways, and I'll try to push those ahead. Bruce Evans at Upper Pine Fire District also added fire districts. Let's not forget about fire districts for eligibility as that's coming out. Jamie, you've got a long question there. You want to come off mute and ask your question?
All right, yeah, thanks, Becca. This is Jamie Gomez with the West Region Wildfire Council. So my question I wrote up was water and watersheds and water resources can be extremely important values at risk for a community, especially in Colorado, as we know with our drought and wildfire situation. So in terms of if that's a value at risk that's been identified at the community scale for a CWPP, but that watershed, maybe those critical watersheds are actually outside of the geographic area of that planning effort. So say it's a county CWPP, but the critical watersheds are actually outside of the county. What do you, Daniel, or anyone else on the call recommend in terms of addressing kind of these water and watershed types of values at risk?
Yeah, Jamie, I'll go first. I mean, I suggest doing precisely what you and your partners have been doing, and that's collaborating together to do everything in your power to encourage treatments in the areas of concern. When it comes to the value of CWPP specifically, by no means am I detracting from the reality that different headwater portions of water providing resources are not of great importance and value to the community itself. But in my mind, I don't necessarily see that expansion of the boundaries for the CWPP really deliver that need, right? So if a community in a more rural western portion of the state is concerned about watershed issues 2 to 3 counties over, it's unfortunate that there are a limited number of options that exist for that particular county, but being involved in collaborative groups to promote federal partners that may own a significant portion of that landscape is really the best mechanism by which that can be addressed. But to expand the boundaries of a planning document intended expressly to minimize the risk to more concrete resources such as homes and lives, that's really what these CWPPs are intended. If anybody else wants to add in, feel free.
I think that's really good direction, and to think about the CWPPs and this is just one little piece of the pie related to our community wildfire protection at really that home and lives level. And there are a lot of other funding sources and avenues out there for collaborative landscape restoration planning and implementation, and I do exactly what Daniel's suggesting and steer towards those groups, not expecting CWPPs to solve those watershed scale issues. Somebody here asked, I'm not sure first name here, V Champlin. Is the State Forest Service going to notify communities whose CWPP is outdated about the need to update them, or is that incumbent on the communities?
It's generally incumbent upon communities. We as an organization are fortunate that we have an opportunity on the horizon to expand a little bit in order to support these impending updates by expanding some of our individual capacity. But until such time that we get more people out into the field to provide more of a direct touch point, we don't really have the means by which we can do that. It is important to note that the current plans that we have, to the best of our knowledge, for every community with a CWPP within the state is hosted on our website. So that's the quickest and easiest way to find out whether or not the community in which you live has a current plan, you know, with the concept of currency being somewhat relative. Yeah,
perfect. And Cindy just posted a link in the chat to that. I'm going to just do one more question here, and then we'll move on to the second part. And if you guys have other things along the way, keep dropping them and we'll try to come back to those at the end. Erica was just asking if there's going to be any more specific guidance surrounding evacuation information that should be included in the plans.
What I've been finding as these questions come up is deference or reliance upon emergency managers within your respective county. Some smaller localities have emergency managers that work to provide that kind of support at a municipal type level or a smaller scale level than at the county. But no, we have decided to not provide any more firm guidance on that area of specialization, as it were, because that's really not our wheelhouse as an organization specifically. So I've had nothing but good experiences with emergency managers in my career as a whole. They're really sharp and intelligent people that are really there to help other folks. FEMA has some additional good resources for that, I believe. I think we have some folks from FEMA on the call, but to be able to get the most direct and accurate and comprehensive answers, I think your best resource is going to your appropriate local emergency manager.
Do you mind if I make a comment?
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Okay, well, I mean, because it's what I've seen, and being a student in CWPPs, is that, you know, the community really latches on to those identified evacuation routes, but they're also could be identified as unsurvivable. And they don't think about fire behavior and waiting for like the actual first responders, not emergency management that's planning strategic and the consequences for the incident, but the responders to make that informed decision on telling them where to go and when it's safe. And I feel like it's almost that we're doing a disservice to our community, providing evacuation routes in CWPPs when, I mean, I've heard hundreds of people make comments that, you know, they just get really wrapped up in a document, no matter how old it is and what the evacuation route says, but it's also classified as impassable, but they told me that was my evacuation route, so that's the direction I'm going in. It's just tough to navigate, but thank you.
No problem, Erica. I mean, thank you for that information. And I mean, explaining that particular issue, I understand that can be a problem, certainly, but that's where there's value in executing this update process, is having those core team members, when they get to that point where you need to make decisions about elucidating evacuation routes or not, or revising those that exist and saying, if these, you know, you could tier the evacuation routes. There are numerous different opportunities that you could, or recommendations that you could make, right? But that is one of the most prominent challenges that we have in a lot of our communities in the state. If there's one way in and one way out, that in and of itself is a problem, but that really could bring up a priority action to supersede one that may have come before it in the past.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all for the great questions and comments. And thank you, Daniel, for sharing these updated standards and guidance. I really appreciate it, and a lot of interest here from the group. Evacuation is a fun and tough one to close on. So I'm going to try and get my computer looking normal here, and I'm going to switch gears here for us. We're going to take another half hour or so for Matt Hamilton with Ohio State University and John Salerno here at Colorado State University to present to us. They lead the CoNIFER project that aims to improve the understanding of wildfire risk mitigation planning and implementation by studying stakeholders and their relationships in CWPPs in Colorado. So they've got like teams of students who have been looking at every word in all the CWPPs in the state, and that's quite impressive. Beveridge and I sit on the advisory committee for that, but they're doing all the work. They're going to be presenting some of their preliminary findings from this project, and they look forward to your feedback. And hopefully they'll cross paths with you. We'll cross paths with one another over the coming months as they're doing more research and the engagement for this work kicks off. So I'm going to turn it over to Matt and John.
Rebecca, thank you very much for that little intro. Right, as you mentioned, we're hopefully going to have the opportunity to engage with a lot of you here on this call in the coming months and have more of a one-on-one or a personal conversation about your experiences with the planning process. And so I'm gonna run through the first small handful of slides here that we have just to introduce the project. It is the CoNIFER project, Community Networks in Fire Environment Resilience. And so the title of the project is pretty contrived, but the theme is right, and I think it's also appropriate for the system and the challenges the communities face, and then and also for our approach or our research questions that we'll try to contextualize here in a few minutes. So like I said, I'm gonna give you a little bit of a project overview. We'll talk a bit about some of the early data collection that's been going on. And then, of course, we want to introduce where we're headed, and that involves hopefully many of you. And we'd like even today to solicit a little bit of discussion, or at the very least, we're happy to answer questions about the project. And we'll offer a couple avenues for engagement here at the end of this set of slides. Okay, and Matt's driving here, so I might have to do a little bit of course correction. So apologies in advance for that. But we want to start just with a little bit of context and framing of the research. And the big point here is that the CWPPs are this really valuable institution, and particularly in the Western states. So this figure and all of the points on the map specifically show individual CWPPs across these Western states with their own individual jurisdiction. And then the purplish blue arcs, those represent actual connections or links or relationships between organizations or actors involved in each CWPP, and links with other CWPPs or organizations or actors involved in other places or jurisdictions. And so this points to kind of the value of everything that's going on in Colorado, but then also across the West and the role that CWPPs play. You're all very familiar with that. But I want to point to Colorado specifically, just because of the density and diversity of CWPPs that are represented across the state. So Colorado is unique in the West in having this extremely high density and also a lot of different approaches to CWPP planning. Okay, Matt, go ahead and advance to the next slide. So I already mentioned this. This is where we're going in the next few minutes. I'll introduce a little bit of the project, and then I'll hand it over to Matt, who's going to talk about our timeline and what we've seen so far, and then solicit a little bit of feedback and also questions if anybody has any here at the end of the little presentation. Go ahead, Matt. So this, Becca touched on this, but this overarching goal of the project is to try and improve understanding of wildfire risk mitigation planning and implementation by studying stakeholder relationships and the CWPP processes here in Colorado. So in other words, we're interested in how CWPPs come together initially, including how the people that are involved in the processes are connected in their communities and then also beyond their communities to other areas. And also how the planning processes might affect implementation down the road and potentially result in more effective or less effective wildfire risk mitigation on the ground. And so this is at least a 3-year, possibly a longer collaboration between some folks here at CSU, the Ohio State University, University of Michigan, and Portland State as well. And so Matt, who is also on the call at OSU, is with Eric Toman, another investigator at OSU. You all probably know Tony Chang here at CSU and CFRI. And then Max Nielsen Pincus and Paige Fisher are the other collaborators at those other organizations. And Becca noted our advisory group. The names got cut off, but in addition to Becca and Dan, Daniel Godwin with Ember Alliance, and then Patty Champ are also on the advisory, the informal advisory group that we have together. Okay, so these are the larger, I guess, or I guess more generalized objectives of the project, and they include to improve the understanding of how social interactions affect collaborative decision making in CWPPs. So this just means how and why people get together in groups and how they approach the collaborative process of planning to reduce fire risk. We're also looking to identify the conditions that shape more effective implementation of risk mitigation, especially activities and plans that are operating at larger spatial scales. So the second objective focuses on what makes for good plans that are effectively implemented on the ground. So we're interested in actions that are actually rolled out. And we're particularly interested in coordination that might be occurring across jurisdictions or boundaries, and then also across different institutional levels, from local to sort of higher order, even at the state or federal level. And we're trying to evaluate the causes of risk mitigation disparities among communities. And so when we say disparities, we're talking about some communities having potentially limited planning and implementation capacity, while others show much more effective or efficient risk mitigation. And so we're interested in what causes these disparities, and then also how potentially support structures or policies could be put in place to try and bridge the gaps that we might see. And then fourth here, to engage and inform local and state and national level decision makers to try and co-produce actionable findings from the research project. And so right now, this job has fallen largely on our advisory committee. A couple of you are here on the call, like we mentioned, and also some early partners in the project. But we're starting to approach the phase where outreach becomes a much bigger part of project activities. And so we'll loop back here in a couple of slides and offer up to you how you all can engage and talk about some other means through which the project is starting to conduct some of the outreach activities. Thanks, Matt. And so this slide here, and then the next slide that we'll get to, this one in particular is reinterpreting those objectives just in the context of research questions that the project is aiming to answer. And I want to bring your attention to a couple points here. This first question, how do risk governance networks affect learning in collaborative planning processes? So when we say risk governance networks, all we're talking about are those links that we saw in the first slide, the map of the Western states, the social network or relational network that connects individuals and their institutions across space and through time. And when we talk about learning, what we're really talking about is just people getting together in a room or virtually and talking about problems and trying to collaborate and innovate solutions to potentially some of these barriers in the planning process. The second question here, how do risk governance networks affect planning outputs, the scale and the boundary spanning potential of risk mitigation plans? When we're talking about planning outputs, these are really the actions that can potentially address the scale of risk and also working with this diversity of stakeholders. The third question here, how do social processes, this includes the learning and the cooperation and potentially competition like we referenced in that first question, how do these processes affect implementation conformance? And especially when we're talking about these large scale boundary spanning risk mitigation activities. Oops, sorry about that. And right, so when we're referring to implementation conformance, again, we're thinking about how CWPPs and the planning processes embedded within them can potentially relate more effectively or efficiently to changes that happen on the ground to reduce risk. And then how do risk governance networks affect risk mitigation outcomes at regional scales, and especially these mitigation disparities? This last question, it's hardest to evaluate, right? But like everyone else, we're interested in how planning can actually mitigate risk on the ground, and including how we can address these disparities that might separate communities. And I think I'm gonna, at this point, turn it over to Matt, who's gonna pick it up with this next slide.
All right, thanks, John. And Drat, I was hoping you were going to do this one because it's so complicated. So the key point here is, this is, we've got a set of research questions, and they all point to understanding risk mitigation outcomes. And just to be totally clear, there's very well qualified people who are studying risk outcomes. What we're trying to understand is risk mitigation outcomes, and the difference is a little bit subtle, but it's important. So we're thinking about capacity and how that might relate to risk in the event of a fire of certain kind of characteristics. And so one way to think about this whole project that John introduced a second ago, I have to apologize too, by the way. I'm coming to you from Ohio, where I'm being attacked by our eastern forests. And I'm losing my voice a little bit from allergies. So if I cut out, that's why. But one way to think about this whole project that John introduced is to sort of work backwards. So we assume that risk and risk mitigation is in some ways a product of all these different kind of intra and interpersonal and even inter-decision-making context related processes, like how the availability of resources or how these learning outcomes, how the types of actions in CWPPs that get proposed, the scale and kind of creativity and so forth of these types of outputs, how all these relate to what actually gets done on the ground within the jurisdiction of a particular CWPP, as well as at these broader spatial scales. And then we go one step backwards from that and say, okay, well, these outcomes of these processes might relate to the processes themselves that John, mentioned a second ago here. So competition, learning, how people, model one CWPP on successful other, examples that might have been, implemented several years earlier, cooperation and so on. And then we go one step further even more, just to think about how this is all embedded within these governance systems, or governance networks, I should say. And again, by governance networks, we're not talking about anything really fancy here. It's just these patterns of interactions among people and CWPPs that we can think of at these local scales within the context of a particular CWPP. Who shows up, how do they know each other, how do these folks interact, share information, and so on. But then also that particular CWPP, and apologies, just for interpreting this figure, these little dots here, these are people. And this square here, imagine that being a CWPP. So we could also think about a whole set of CWPPs that share common, individuals who contributed. And so those all comprise a network as well. This is a nice way perhaps of kind of introducing where we are in this project. A lot of this information we've collected already. Some we've kind of collected in bits and pieces, and we hope to collect more over the summer, perhaps in conversations with some folks, on this particular call. And all that type of information is kind of related to these processes. So we're really trying to kind of understand what happens, get under the skin of these collaborative processes, and try to understand some of these factors that matter both in the context of the CWPP development process, but then also in terms of what gets implemented and how that matters for risk mitigation. So at this point, enough about kind of the project, and now we can perhaps share just a little bit of what we've been collecting so far. as John mentioned, we're a couple years into a 3 or possibly 4 year project, and so what we're sharing here is preliminary. Hasn't been published yet. It's kind of some of it's not even been collected yet. But here's that same network that John showed earlier, but instead of the whole Western United States, now we're zeroing in here on Colorado. Colorado, I should mention, is essentially a hotspot of collaborative local risk fire risk mitigation. And then you can even see within the state of Colorado, there are these other hotspots, which track in some ways with population centers, but in other contexts, just reflect those patterns of interaction among people. These data, I should mention, are simply extracted from the documents and the rosters of participants, and then comparing, who participated in multiple CWPPs. And so that's what we mean by the network size, is the number of individuals who have, over this now 20 year period, this kind of cumulative growth of individuals. It's a pretty pretty extensive network of people within the state of Colorado. That's one of about 10 reasons why we're focusing on Colorado. Just a little snapshot of the data that we've got, in hand, I should say, collected so far. Actually, as Becca mentioned, there's a team of students, and they're going through all these plans. There's about 250 in Colorado, and we've worked our way through the first 160 of those. And we've focused our efforts so far on understanding the types of actions that are proposed or recommended, prioritized, and so on within these plans. And so that adds up to about 14,000 so far, just from these 160. And so here you're just looking at the distribution of the numbers of actions per plan. So for example, there's one plan out here that just went crazy, 800 actions, but the majority of them have, in this area here, maybe a little bit less than 100. And these are kind of discrete risk mitigation activities that are described at one level or another, at one level of detail or another. And so, a question might be, well, what types of activities count? And it's interesting that Daniel Beveridge just a minute ago was talking about how, of course, fuels reduction is really important, but so is education. And as it turns out, across all the plans that we've coded so far, there are a handful of types of actions that are present, that are documented within 80+% of these plans. And the clear kind of leader is fuels reduction, but then there's education, activities that focus on, or actions that focus on infrastructure and protection of infrastructure and so on, collaboration, accessibility, and so on. It begins to taper off only when you kind of move towards environmental stewardship, which gets away at some of the kind of core, or that often relates to other types of goals for land management, and then planning personnel, which we could discuss later a little bit if there's interest. Let me just flip to another slightly different way of representing these data. Instead of kind of normalized or in relation to the number of plans in which these actions are present, here is kind of representation across all the sets of actions. So I mentioned we've coded so far about 14,000. And you can see that fuels reduction here accounts for about 1/3 of those, or maybe a little bit more than 1/3. And so it's clear in a way, kind of the most common action. And then you have these others, accessibility and infrastructure and so on. And then other types of actions like planning personnel, and thinking about environmental stewardship, or thinking about updating codes or covenants or policies and trying to influence policy and so on. Much less common relative to, for example, fuels reduction. One of the other ways in which we've been thinking so far about these actions is the degree to which they are planned, or to put that another way, the intentionality. And so when we think about plans, we think about planned actions. That is to say, there might be some funding identified, or a target for funding to implement the plan, people identified who could carry it out, a place, mapped, and so on. And so those certainly comprise, a good portion of these actions that we've accounted for so far. But by far the most common are these actions that are recommended, which is, by that I mean that it's discrete and there's some justification, or it's described in some way, but it's not proposed as part of a kind of a planned course of action. So it's not kind of getting to that level of being, intentional enough, or as intentional as the planned actions. And we find also that a relatively large number of these actions are almost more like statements of beliefs. So we call those like unplanned actions. So convictions, for example, about how fire mitigation should be carried out. And we're accounting for those because we think that they're really important. But you could almost think about this as sort of a hierarchy, getting more and more, maybe going up, like more and more specific, and with greater certainty that those actions might actually be implemented. Well, just one other way to think about these data is by those people, or those groups of people who are identified as kind of the actors that are responsible. And by far the most common actor is no actor, which is to say that there is no person or no group or types of groups that was identified as the one responsible for implementing that action. And the second most common here is the community members. So, residents of a particular community, which is actually very interesting to us because it suggests that a lot of these actions might not be associated with, say, projects that might be large scale and kind of multiple, spanning multiple, private properties. But these are things that are encouraging, local residents to carry out activities around, homes and so on. And then only when you start getting down this list, and if you're squinting at this, you'll see that, there's still some data cleaning to be done. But as you get down the list, you start to see organizations, homeowners associations, of course, local fire departments and districts, county organizations, and so on. So these are the data in hand so far. And with respect to actions that we've coded from these plans, what's next is, well, we're going to be out in the field for me. I'm not from Colorado, so I'll be going out to Colorado. The rest of the field the rest of the team who's already there, will be fanning out across the state and talking to people who are involved in one capacity or another in the development or the revision of CWPPs, to try to get at some of those questions that John described earlier. How did that process work out? Characterizing cooperation or any sort of conflict, or not conflict necessarily, competition among plans and so on. So here we are in the second year, more or less, of this project, and we're thinking about measuring learning and systems thinking, which we can come back to that later if there's a question about it. But learning and cooperation, possibly competition, but then also presenting these actions that we've extracted from these planning documents before people who participated in them and said, how did it go? What happened after the plan was developed? What was implemented? How was it implemented differently? What were the factors that were really important for those implementation outcomes? And then, as John mentioned, we're very interested in disparities from one region to the next, and so thinking about how can these local processes kind of aggregate up to these more regional scales. So the last thing that we'll show here is, we're moving into phases of this project where engagement for us is really important, and we're beginning to be at a point where we've got results and insights that we can share with communities of people, such as those of you on this call here. So we've got a mailing list, which I'll drop these links and everything in the chat in just a minute here. We've got a mailing list. A few of you are on it. Please drop us a line. We'd be delighted to share with you, other findings and reports and all sorts of outputs and news coming out of this project. We've also developed a survey to gauge to gauge kind of perspectives and and feedback on the new, the revised guidelines for the minimum standards for developing CWPPs that Dan Beveridge spoke about earlier. And so if you use these, the QR codes, please, and you're interested in providing that feedback in an anonymous way, please follow that link. We've also got a direct link here to the survey. And then the last way for us to sort of engage with folks that we've identified here on the slide is, we'll be talking to people over the summer. We'll be doing interviews with people who participated in CWPPs that were developed 10 years ago and more recently. And so if you're interested in talking to us, well, we'd be delighted to follow up with you. And if that's the case, please just drop us a line at this CoNIFER project at coloradostate.edu, and we'll follow up. We'll be in the field in May, June, and parts of July. So that pretty much wraps up what we had wanted to share with you. But as John and others mentioned, we'll be delighted to field questions. And then if you all would indulge us, we've also got questions that we're interested in learning from you about all these types of things, but I don't want to make any assumptions about what folks want to talk about. So maybe I'll just pause here and see if we could field any questions that folks might have.
Thanks so much, Matt. And there's not a lot popping up in the chat yet as far as clarifying questions or what folks want to know. But if anyone wants to come off mute and ask a question or pop it in the chat, please do. And I guess as you all are looking at those slides, if there's something that really tickles you, or you have a response that you want to make sure gets across, also feel free to come off mute and give your feedback to Matt.
Hey, Becca.
Yeah.
It's Beveridge. I just wanted to jump in and reference back to one of the slides that Matt had brought up that I thought was really valuable and something that I didn't touch on directly in my brief presentation, but the idea of not having a leader delegated or designated or recommended for implementing a task. That's something that we had discussed, and I now realize the error in my presentation for not bringing that to light. But in the must include portion related to the relative priority table that I did address, we did enter in there, there should be a recommendation for each of those tasks to have an implementation leader. So that was intended to address that. Now it's a recommended leader. It's not this group will execute every portion of this task. It's simply a recommendation. Thanks for bringing that up, Matt. And that was kind of an undercurrent that was really recognized to be an issue for some time with some of these plans, as nobody was really put to task, I guess, to support completion of some of these. So thank you for reminding me of that, Matt, and I will make an adjustment.
Yeah, I was noticing also that tie between your conversation, Daniel, around implementable and needing to have projects identified that are implementable, and that scale within the CoNIFER project of coding things as to whether they're implementable when a relatively small portion of it actually were, and that includes that element of, is there an identified actor for implementation? So great crossover.
I'll just add in relation to this point that you're making there, Daniel, that there's probably a lot of correlation between this way of characterizing actions and this level too. So I would suspect, and we haven't looked at this exactly yet, but your comment prompts me to, there are a lot of these missing actions for which there's a kind of responsible actor or leader missing, probably fall in this camp, the statements of beliefs and maybe a lot of these recommended actions. But yeah, I mean, we could certainly follow up and look at that.
Right, and so like an example, if your plan said homeowners should develop defensible space, it would be a recommended action that it may be the level of recommended, and that's gonna fall under those community members that are the responsible actors.
That's right. Yeah, yeah.
And I hope that people are seeing this and recognizing the context is towards the direction of things that are gonna help you with your plans. I don't know, can you pull up that slide that had the different kinds of actions again? We had that question, and that's another point that Daniel really raised, was that we're not just talking about fuel reduction. So just for folks to be thinking about kinds of actions maybe include. And we had a question in the chat earlier about if you're, what were they asking about? Evacuation planning, or if that could be supported through grants. Well, there's all kinds of things that you can put into your plan. If it's not in the plan, then it's not going to be eligible. So just think about that when you're thinking about your actions. And it's not going to be accepted as a plan for some purposes. Your action may not be accepted as a viable action if it's not implementable, if you're not identifying who and some level of permissions or local support for doing it. So, but I would like to, it looks like we have a couple of comments here in the chat. Pointing out the need for identifying project leaders that really speaks to the importance of supporting and funding community capacity for staff with the local group and the fire districts. And I'm not sure if that relates to your comment about the planning personnel as well. You want to touch on that a little more?
Sorry, did you say to me?
Yeah. Does the planning personnel relate to that a little bit?
Yeah, it absolutely does. And from working with the students who are coding these plans, you know, they've remarked a number of times that it almost seemed like the plan, some plans, of course, were written in ways that were kind of bending over backwards to avoid identifying somebody. And so it could be the case that the people in a more informal way were kind of, stepping forward as the point person for a particular action, but maybe were reluctant to be designated as the leader. That might be going on. That would be something that we would obviously be following up on in the field. But yeah, for sure. Leadership is crucial, and actually reading a lot of these plans, there is a lot of language just about the importance of leadership, towards the front end of the plan, which was not exactly the part that we were focusing on for coding.
Let's, will you flip to your questions for folks so folks can reflect on those? And I'm going to ask one that came up here in the chat for Daniel while you're getting there. Bob Harvey asked Daniel to review the requirements of a jurisdiction or state to have codes or other directives in place to qualify for grants through a CWPP.
Becca, I think that there may be some confusion related to the CWGG funding. And Becca, I don't know if you want to perhaps try to reiterate your understanding of the CWGG piece. I did have pulled up the infrastructure law briefer. So as you carry on a little bit, I can perhaps pull out some language. But again, that's all tentative.
I did put the specific language up further in the chat about the roof requirements. I'm wondering if Bob, come off mute if you want to ask this more specifically, but I'm wondering if he's curious more about just having to have a CWPP in place in order to be eligible for certain kinds of grants as well. So are there any other specific ties aside from CWDG, I guess, related to like how that comes across in Furworm or other grants that you're aware of?
Right. So when it comes to the federal grants that I support administration of at present, there's two. One is the State Fire Assistance Wildland and Urban Interface Grant Program. And the other is the CAFA grant program, Community Assistance Funding Adjacent to National Forest Systems Land. Very long titles, but Both of them do request information about CWPPs, and they, in a way, have built in a bit of a tiered system similar to what we've already recommended for this kind of ranking. So if you do not have a CWPP, it doesn't exclude you as being eligible for those funding sources, but it increases your odds by proving that you and your community have thought critically about the risk that you're exposed to and already developed a plan saying, this is how we will prioritize reduction of our risk. So with those two grants specifically, it doesn't exclude a group from being eligible for those funding sources, but it improves the competitive nature.
Great. Thank you. I think my only tag on would be just that relationship, and you just very briefly touched on the relationship with hazard mitigation grants, and that those countywide grants and those jurisdictional grants are requirements in order to be eligible for FEMA funding. And I just wanted to point out that this update in the recommendation of updating CWPPs every 5 years also overlays the CWPP planning timeframe with hazard mitigation planning timeframe. So it's definitely something to look at if your community's at the point where they're updating that other plan anyhow, and then would, you know, tie in and potentially make your CWPP, your wildfire actions eligible for FEMA mitigation funding. And then Erica pointed out a really interesting approach that sounds like Jeffco is taking, looking at incorporating, working on their transportation plan and comprehensive plan, tying in with their community wildfire protection plan. So that's a very a unique approach that I haven't heard of happening in other places. I want to just ask for any final reflections on these questions that Matt presented for the group. Does anybody want to chime in and give any other additional feedback to Matt at this time for the CoNIFER project?
Could I actually jump in? And I don't know if this is allowed, but I was really intrigued by a comment that was in the chat. I think actually not about our presentation, but about yours, Daniel. Here, I'm just trying to find it. It was from Jamie Gomez, talking about kind of interjurisdiction linkages. This is how I would think about it. You're talking about, you know, water resources that are, you know, outside of a jurisdiction of the CWPP. And to be honest, this is sort of what this question was asking about. They're not necessarily, you know, exposing the CWPP to risk from that water resource. But I'm wondering, Jamie, if you're still on the call, I would just be extremely interested in hearing how that discussion sort of happened in the context of either developing the CWPP or after it, and how do people think about, you know, maybe reaching out to other CWPPs or other kind of planning processes within which that water resource or watershed, you know, lies. Oops.
Jamie, are you still on? You want to chime in?
Becca, I could also follow up with Jamie later too.
Yeah, and we're almost at time here, so I think that might be good for Jamie to know that we'll follow up on that one. But that's a great question, and I'm sure Jamie would be somebody on your list to connect with. Anyway, I'm going to drop a few follow-up items here in the chat for some upcoming activities for you all to know about, and I'll try to make sure with the recording that we have some of these different links to the surveys and the presentation, if you're willing to share, Matt, making that available as well for folks. And I'm just going to close with a few upcoming items that Fire Adapted Colorado is working on. So thank you all so much for your time. For those of you who stuck in there and listened to all of the research findings so far and are considering what that means for you and your place. And I know we're all looking forward to that as unfolds and learning more about community wildfire defense grants. I did mention that the statewide network hosts the Colorado Wildland Fire Conference with many of our member partners. And if you're interested in being a part of that planning group, we generally meet the first Tuesday morning of each month. So if you're interested in helping to put on the statewide conference, please let me know. I also mentioned the 2022 Wildfire Preparedness Press Conference that Director Morgan's going to be giving with Governor Polis this Friday morning, and the link is in the chat, as well as the link to the YouTube channel where you can watch that live or record it afterwards if you have an interest in that. And then next month on May 25th in the morning, I'll be co-hosting an infrastructure law and forest collaboratives overview and program potential webinar. And that registration link is live if you're interested in hearing more. That's not going to get into the community wildfire defense grants. It's going to mostly focus on what's coming down the pike with existing programs. And then for those of you who are FACO members, just a reminder that our next member call is the same time slot, 1 to 2:30 on Monday, May 16th. And FACO members can also be looking for a renewal for membership to their organization's primary contact coming in early May. So that's all we have for you. Matt, John had to jump off. Daniel, thank you guys so much for sharing today. And thank you to everybody who joined the call. And I'm willing to stand for a few minutes if anyone has direct questions.